Today's quick tip looks at how to create a simple Power BI DAX measures testing visual. At the end of the process, you'll have a matrix visual like the one I have here that will update you and inform you as you change your DAX formulas as to whether any of your calculations have changed inappropriately. Let's rewind to the beginning and see how I've built this. I would contend that the first step to a test is knowing what the values should be, as specified by an authority on the data. In this case, that authority happens to be my alter ego, who was kind enough to send me this email. I have a basic data target value table laid out, which you can download from my blog, that I'm going to use to store this information. The first test I'll simply call Kroger Bakery labor costs, and I'll add its target value. For the variance, since I know they're rounding, I know that my target value should be within about 501 of the calculated number that I come up with, since the target is rounded by 1,000. I use the details column to provide extensive information about the test so that, say I have 40 different tests from different sources, I can reference this data table and determine where they came from. Inputting the other two tests will follow the same pattern, where I impute the variance based upon the representation of the data in details, such that an exact figure is plus or minus 1, and the rounded to 100 comes out to plus or minus 51. Once I've loaded all of this data within the table, I'll normally save this as a CSV, and once I do, we're ready to hop over to Power BI and begin working. As I bounce over to my Power BI, you can see I have connected to my primary data source, in this case a single data table from my Power Pivot course. I have a calendar table with the relationship defined between it and my labor table, and I have my underscore test values table connected from the Excel file we just populated based upon that email. In this way, as test values are added to the test values workbook, they'll populate into the data model to support validation. Now before we create our visual, we need to do some initial setup. The first step is to jump into the Power Query editor via the Transform Data button and add a set of headers for us to use. I have a short M script saved with the table I use, so I'm going to create a new blank query, open up my M script in Notepad, copy it, paste it, name my query, and then click Close and Apply. Of course, someday I'll come up with a consistent table name, but until I do, I'll just keep naming it whatever I come up with, as I name it Unit Test Fields here. With all of the data in place, I already have some measures written for me to test, so let's fill out the framework. The first step to filling out the framework is actually defining the very first target value, calculated value, and unit test, since the framework measures will throw a fit if you don't put something in them. I'll start with a single target value measure, TV equals sum target. You could stop here and then use this measure, or you can define individual target measures for each test. When I define the individual tests, I simply use calculate TV test values ID equals 1, where 1 would be the numeric value of the TV that I'm looking at. I'm going to go ahead and use both approaches, and we'll get into the meat of this in just a moment. Up next is our first calculated value, abbreviated CV001. Note, I strongly recommend the CV number notation for the naming, as it makes the follow-up steps fast and easy. For this, I'm going to create a measure that applies the very specific filters that I'm interested in against an existing measure for testing. In the case of CV001, I would generally keep the Excel file open in a secondary window on my secondary monitor and reference the details column to figure out what I need to do. In this case, I calculate the total labor costs subject to filters of Kroger on the store column and bakery on the store department. I even add a comment at the end as to what this should come out to, but that's an optional step that I'll typically exclude in the interests of speed. Finally, we'll create our first unit test, or UT for short. The unit test will simply be a measure that takes the difference between the target value and the calculated value for this particular test. So I'll set UT001 equals TV001 minus CV001, or an alternative would be to use the test values table for context and simply use the TV measure minus CV001. This group of measures, TV, CV, and UT001, is a singular unit test. With it in place, I can now implement what I call my unit testing framework. This is simply a pair of measure patterns that I've developed and saved to a text file. The first one I'll use is the framework results. This measure returns either the target value, the calculated value, or the test result, depending upon which of the fields is in context. It's mostly commentary, since the vast majority of the effort goes into defining the CV, TV, and UT measures. Since my field's table name isn't consistent with how I wrote this, I'm going to update the var field to point to the appropriate table, and then let's implement our first test value. Since I've used my basic naming convention, I can simply uncomment the very first line within my list of switch statements. To pair with this measure is one I call Unit Testing Framework Colors. The results measure will return numbers for display in the matrix, while the colors measure will return a color for formatting each cell of the matrix, either green for a passing test or red for a failing test. Again, I'm going to copy this text file and paste it into a new DAX measure. I can uncomment the very first line to set us up and lay out our visualization and see how it looks. To visualize this, I'm going to use the Matrix tool. Within the Matrix tool, I'm going to set my column header equal to the unit tests field, and I'm going to set the row header to my test descriptions field. The values section will use the unit testing framework results measure that we defined earlier. I'm going to remove the different subtotal fields as they don't provide any value and only take up space. Within the conditional formatting region, I'm going to turn background color on and then open the advanced controls options. Here, I'm going to change the format by to the field value, and then I'm going to use my framework colors field to define it. I now have an all-green table because I don't differentiate between implemented and unimplemented tests with my color framework, just yet anyways. Now that the heavy lifting has been done, let's see how difficult it is to implement the remaining tests. Each of the CV and UT measures I'll make will be very similar to these first ones. So similar, in fact, that I'll start CV002 by copying CV001. For this CV, I only want the store filtered with no department filter, so I can adjust the DAX slightly by getting rid of the labor store department and changing Kroger to Tom Thumb, and I'm done. For the unit test, I'll set it equal to TV minus CV002. With this simple syntax, I'm now ready to go update my framework results and framework colors. In the framework results, I'm going to copy the line immediately after underscore measure and paste it one line below. Once I do this, I only need to replace each one with a 2, and that's it. I'm done. I now have 2 tests implemented. Next up are the framework colors. I can do the same thing where I copy the first row from the switch function, paste it below, and then swap the 1 values with 2s. The process for adding the third test is nearly identical, so I'll rush through it quickly and we can see how well our measures hold up to our test targets. Once I implement this third test, we can see that the calculated value for our average May labor cost is off by about 4,960 from our target value. Since this third test looks at the average labor costs measure, I can troubleshoot what's going on by looking at the measure's DAX formula and attempting to figure out what's happening. In this particular example, I've made a very obvious error. I've added 5,000 to the calculated average. Once I correct this measure by commenting this out, all 3 of my tests pass. Programmers use unit tests like these to ensure that additional changes to their code do not have adverse effects on past functionality and to assist them in developing new features. This particular approach offers an easy way to add and manage target values, create new calculated values, and define tests all within Power BI without a huge amount of time and effort outside of that initial setup. Additional features like coloring for non-implemented tests and filters that split the tests into passing and failing are only steps away. You'll find a downloadable zip file on our blog page that contains this PBIX file as well as the text files that I keep my little DAX and M snippets in. I'd love to hear your suggestions and thoughts about this approach and success stories using it to improve your own processes.